Hello, everybody. Our regulars, our irregulars, the people who come in for the first time, people who have been here for many of our previous iterations of this. Welcome to the next edition of the UNESCO Chair series on reading and writing for sustainability and the literature of sustainability talks, principally aimed at I think implicitly demonstrating that all talk of SDG cannot be left to the hard sciences or the social scientists, and that literature definitely has something to say about it. Today, the focus is on SDG 8, that is decent work and economic growth. And our speaker today is Cindy Weinstein of the California Institute of Technology, or probably called Caltech. Welcome to all of you, and a more formal welcome to Professor Weinstein and everybody else from Atul, project assistant in the UNESCO chair team, and to my colleague Anna Kurian, who's here as part of the organizing committee. Over to you, Atul. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Welcome, everyone. And we are very glad to have Professor Weinstein with us today. And if I may introduce her to the audience, Cindy Weinstein is the Ellie and Edith Broad Professor of English at the California Institute of Technology. She has written several monographs on US literature and is currently at work on Always Nevermore, The Unending Death of Edgar Allan Poe. She has also edited, co-edited, and contributed to many essay collections, including the Norton Critical Edition of Herman Melville's Pierre or the Ambiguities with Robert S. Levine. Most recently, she wrote with neurologist Dr. Bruce Miller, Finding the Right Words, A Story of Literature, Grief, and the Brain, published by the Johns Hopkins University Press in 2021, which has been awarded the 2022 Memoir Prize for Books. Her talk today is titled, They Talk of the Dignity of Work, Bosch, Melville, Moby Dick, and the Value of Writing. Over to you, Professor Weinstein.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here and just want to extend my gratitude to Professor Nayar, Kurian, and thank you, Atul, for making sure that the slide presentation goes smoothly. And thank you all for coming today. So I'm going to get started. Atul already told you the title of the talk is They Talk of the Dignity of Work, Bosch, Melville, Moby Dick, and the Value of Writing. Decent work comprises a foundational concept of SGD 8. SGD 8 includes many more targets. Can you do the next slide, Atul? Such as promoting beneficial and sustainable tourism, a global youth employment strategy, and innovative policies to support economic productivity. The United Nations SGD framework asks, what does decent work mean? And defines it this way, quote, decent work means opportunities for everyone to get work that is productive and delivers a fair income, security in the workplace, and social protection for families, better prospects for personal development and social integration, unquote. But I'm neither a political scientist nor an economist, so when I think of decent work, it's usually from the rather limited point of view of being an English professor in the US who studies and writes about US literature for a living and has for a long while. I was lucky to join the profession decades ago when tenure-track positions were not on the verge of collapse, when the humanities were not under institutional and governmental attack, when university presses were able to send you gratis a copy of a volume of essays to which you contributed one, and when artificial intelligence didn't just steal one's writing without permission. No more. My aim today, though, is not to talk about the present-day difficulties of pursuing a career in the humanities, and now STEM, with the devastating cuts to the National Science Foundation in the US and the National Institute of Health, and the draconian reduction in indirect costs, and the precarity that defines all careers at the university level, but the very real hardships of making a living through writing in 19th century America. The writers of that time, I want to suggest, confronted their own concerns about sustainability, whether those were economic, environmental, or ethical. And in the case of Herman Melville's Moby Dick, all three. Next slide, please. Before getting to Melville, I want to delineate in very broad strokes the larger cultural concern about decent work in the antebellum period. Slavery, of course, represented the polar opposite of this concept. Despite Trump's current attacks on the Smithsonian Museum for its critical, as inaccurate representations of slavery, and Governor of Florida Ron DeSantis's newfangled and fascist curriculum that makes the case for the positives of the peculiar institution, there was and is, of course, nothing decent about it. Defenders of slavery, such as George Fitzhugh in Cannibals All, published in 1857, claimed that factory labor was actually even less decent than slavery because at least masters, according to this argument, provided shelter, food, and clothing to slaves, whereas industrial tycoons in New England factories did neither. Melville thought hard and wrote powerfully about both of these indecencies. Next slide, please. Benito Cereno, for example, describes the horrors of the Middle Passage and the lengths to which kidnapped Blacks went to protect their children, their loved ones, and their lives. The murderous logic of slavery is met with a murderous response. Babo is the character whose artistic vision, as it were, helps to blind the racist Delano to the mutiny that has taken place. In one of the depositions at the conclusion of the novella, we learn, quote, "The Negro Babo was he who traced the inscription at the front of the ship," the inscription being "Follow your leader," and, quote, "he was the plotter from first to last." Melville is not exactly Babo, but like him, they are both authors who inscribe, plot, and create fictions. Perhaps closer to home is Melville's The Paradise of Bachelors and the Tartarus of Maids, a diptych that pits the indecency of loud, appetitive male mercenary barristers against the silence, starvation, and impoverishment of factory women, whose relation to the machines they operate looks more like sexual assault than industrial labor. The narrator writes, quote, "In one quarter stood some huge frame of ponderous iron with a vertical thing like a piston, periodically rising and falling upon a heavy wooden block. Before it, its tame minister stood a tall girl, feeding the iron animal with half quires of rose-hued notepaper, which at every downward dab of the piston-like machine received in the corner the impress of a wreath of roses." It is no coincidence that the New England factory where the women work produces paper, the material required by Melville to write the critique about how that material is produced. The aestheticization of the paper, as illustrated by the rose that is impressed upon the paper, depends upon the blanching of the maids' bodies. Melville is profoundly aware of how his own labor of writing participates in this exploitation. He ties his authorial voice to their silenced ones. Their bodies become depleted. Their work operates against the ideas and ideals of sustainability. And this slide gives you an idea of how much money Melville made during his lifetime as a writer. Next slide, please. What can an author do? Many writers in the 19th century wrote about the challenges of their work. I'm thinking in particular of Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Blithedale Romance, which is based on his 6-month stint at Brook Farm in West Roxbury, Massachusetts, a utopian socialist community where an immersion in manual labor promised a renewed sense of purpose and camaraderie. It didn't quite work out that way for Hawthorne, who was unable to get any writing done. He preferred the loneliness of the custom house to the requirements of group living. Like his character, Owen Warland, in The Artist of the Beautiful, Hawthorne's idea of decent work involves not only solitude, but a liberation from clock time. Ironically, Owen repairs clocks and watches for a living, but his real desire lies in a release from their dominion. quote, as the summer advanced, he almost totally relinquished his business and permitted Father Time, so far as the old gentleman was represented by the clocks and watches under his control, to stray at random through human life, making infinite confusion among the train of bewildered hours. Next slide, please. Edgar Allan Poe often took a more humorous approach to the work of writing. He caricatured the literary magazine world in which he operated, calling attention to the absurdities of its conventions in any number of short stories. For example, in How to Write a Blackwood article, the writer in the story, Miss Psyche, is instructed as follows, quote, if you desire to say bread and butter, do not by any means say it outright. You may say anything and everything approaching to bread and butter. You may hint at buckwheat cake, or you may even go as far as to insulate oatmeal porridge. But if bread and butter is your real meaning, be cautious, my dear Psyche, not on any account to say bread and butter. I assured him that I would never say it again as long as I lived. Next slide, please. Perhaps most famously contra Hawthorne, Henry David Thoreau describes the labor he loves at Walden Pond while checking out, though not completely, from life in Concord, Massachusetts. The indecency of work has a particular sartorial red flag about which he warns us, quote, I say beware of all enterprises that require new clothes, and not rather a new wearer of clothes. If there is not a new man, how can the new clothes be made to fit? If you have any enterprise before you, try it in your old clothes. My point in offering up these quotations from canonical authors from the mid-19th century is to underline just how aware they were, and many others such as Harriet Beecher Stowe of Uncle Tom's Cabin and Fanny Fern of Ruth Hall, how aware they were of the conditions of and problems with work, especially with respect to slavery, factory labor, and yes, writing. Next slide, please. Ralph Waldo Emerson said in his essay Self-Reliance, published in 1841, quote, do your work and I shall know you. Do your work and you shall reinforce yourself. Next slide, please. Melville disagreed. 10 years later, in an 1851 letter to Hawthorne, Melville lamented, quote, what I feel most moved to write, that is banned. It will not pay. Yet altogether write the other way I cannot. So the product is a final hash, and all my books are botches. Here's some other things Melville said about work. Next slide, please. About Redburn and Whitejacket, he complained to his father-in-law, Lemuel Shaw, quote, they are two jobs which I have done for money, being forced to it as other men to sawing wood, and I have been obliged to refrain from writing the kind of book I would wish to. Next slide, please. And in another letter to Everett Dykink, his editor, Melville bemoans having to write those two books, quote, with duns all around his chair and perching on his pen and diving in his inkstand. Several years later, September 5, 1877 to be exact, after the mixed reception of Moby Dick, especially in the US, the British welcomed it much more heartily, and the disaster that was Pierre, and the short stories and the poems, Melville expressed his frustrations to his cousin, Catherine G. Lansing, in a letter from which the title of today's talk is taken. He writes, quote, whoever is not in the possession of leisure can hardly be said to possess independence. They talk of the dignity of work, bosh. True work is the necessity of poor humanity's earthly condition. The dignity is in leisure. Besides, 99/100 of all the work done in the world is either foolish and unnecessary or harmful and wicked. That's RuPaul there. Next slide. He had, of course, written about this discontent in Bartleby the Scrivener, and as we have seen in the Paradise of Bachelors and Tartars of Maids. But the value of writing had not yet completely curdled for Melville when his masterpiece was published in 1851. The estrangement of labor, as examined by Karl Marx, as demanded by Ahab, as enshrined by political compromises with pro-slavery forces, could still be overcome through literature, or at least Melville thought as much. This is the project, upending the means of literary production to overcome alienation, of Melville's masterpiece. To the extent that Melville accomplished this task, his work, and more specifically Moby Dick or the Whale, meets the ideals of sustainability. I want to suggest in the remainder of my talk that the novel does just that and even exceeds it. But before discussing the novel, I'd like to revisit some of the most important components of SDG 8. In February 2025, the United Nations convened a meeting to discuss progress on SDG 8 in anticipation of the July 2025 High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. In reviewing this February document, a few things stood out to me. First, the July theme would be advancing sustainable, inclusive science and evidence-based solutions for the 2030 Agenda and its SDGs for leaving no one behind. The document explains that there are 12 targets comprising SDG 8, but the only one that's been successfully met is 8.10, financial access, by which is meant, quote, strengthen the capacity of domestic financial institutions to encourage and expand access to banking, insurance, and financial services for all. According to the progress report, quote, when compared to other SDGs and measured at the level of targets, the balance on progress on SDG 8 is among the worst, unquote. The upshot of the July meeting was a declaration, quote, calling for urgent coordinated action to accelerate progress on the SDGs, which, according to Bob Ray, president of the UN Economic and Social Council, quote, represent the common sense of humanity. Second, the emphasis on productive throughout SDG 8 also strikes me as illuminating and significant. Target 8.2 mentions higher levels of economic productivity. 8.3 describes productive activities, which interestingly includes, quote, creativity and innovation. 8.5 features productive employment, and so on. Exactly what productive means remains undefined, even though the word is deployed repeatedly throughout the target list. What does productive mean? And what is, quote, a high value added and labor intensive sector? For what it's worth, Melville seemed to be at his unhappiest when he was most productive. He wrote Redburn and Whitejacket in about 10 weeks. I linger on these two observations, not because I disagree necessarily with them, but because they're not as inclusive as they could and should be. And here is where my career as an English professor and close reader enters. Science and evidence-based solutions are, of course, key. Knowledge is power, and data helps us understand where the power lies and where it doesn't. But there are other ways of knowing, of producing that have value. Narrative, for example, art, storytelling. Interestingly, productive remains undefined, even though the word is deployed throughout the target list. What does it mean? And what is a high value added and labor intensive sector? From what I've been able to determine, such a mode of production, a way of being productive, doesn't have a place in the world of the SDGs. Technology and innovation have pride of place naturally. Even when creativity is acknowledged, its value exists only when coupled with innovation. No doubt this absence has a great deal to do with scale, and one may need to look no further than the global ambitions of the SDGs for an explanation of why narrative, by which I mean the individual stories of people, can't be found. Economists Madhavi Venkatasan and Juliano Luongo address a similar point in their book, Sustainable Economic Growth and Decent Work for All. They lean on the International Labor Organization's goals for decent work and point out how, unlike SDG 8, an awareness of qualitative, harder to evaluate measures is essential when considering what decent work means. They quote an evidence-based study that reveals, quote, an increase in employment does not necessarily mean an increase in well-being. The work of scholars in geography also critiques SDG 8 for its insistent focus on full growth, which they argue ought to be reoriented toward a concept of what they call degrowth or post-growth, which they define as, quote, a reframing of the very definition of economic prosperity towards enhancing well-being and human happiness. The neoliberal perspective that links GDP growth with success, full stop, has something to do with the occlusions discussed by academic scholarship on SDG and which I'm interested in exploring through Moby Dick. And here I want to say that Professor Nair's initial vision for this series of talks on SDGs in relation to the humanities was going to be very interdisciplinary, and what I would give right now for an economist to respond to my close reading and my questions. Perhaps someone in the audience will. But back to the question of productivity. Next slide. Karl Marx, of course, wrote a great deal about the means of production and the multiple ways capital exploits labor, leading to the devaluation of labor and wages, and the experience of alienation. Chapter 4 of the Theories of Surplus Value includes this, quote, "Only labor which is directly transformed into capital is productive." In Volume 1 of Capital, he writes, quote, "That labor alone is productive who produces surplus value for the capitalist." The emphasis on productivity in SDG 8 has been remarked upon by other more qualified scholars, such as those who write this in their 2023 Frontiers in Sociology article, quote, "Tensions between productivity enhancing and decent labor logic hinder the creation of treatments with persistent performance benefits." The indication is that the focus of SDG 8 remains on GDP and per capita growth, which is problematic. For instance, the GDP, quote, that productive boundary excludes much social reproductive work. In 2020, a special issue of Sustainable Development Goals Perspective was released, and it included an article that critiqued SDG 8 because of its failure to align its ideals of decent work relative to SDG 5, which calls, quote, "for the recognition of the value of unpaid care and domestic work." SDG 8, as well as several of the other SDG goals and Moby Dick, converge in very interesting ways. The shared focus on labor, natural resources, one's responsibility to her fellow human being, other species, and the natural world, for example. As if that weren't enough of an overlap, SDG 7 is affordable and clean energy. SDG 12 is responsible consumption and production. SDG 14 is life below water. And the critiques overlap as well, by which I mean Melville's novel sees some of the contradictions and problems inherent in SDG 8. He also, I think, writes his way out of the problematic over-reliance on productivity as defined by SDG 8 and into sustainability. The remainder of my talk will discuss just how he does that. Earlier, I mentioned Moby Dick's immersion in ideas of sustainability, whether those are economic, environmental, or ethical. And these topics have been examined over the years. So I'm going to pick one piece of literary criticism to represent each topic using a key passage from Moby Dick as a point of departure. Next slide. Oh, so these are some of the social scientists who were commenting on SDG 8. Sorry about that. Next slide. Okay, here we go. Economic concerns saturate Moby Dick, whether Ishmael is meditating on the virtues of getting paid as a sailor as opposed to paying as a guest of the ship, or the Quaker owners, Bildad and Peleg, playing good cop, bad cop, and screwing over Ishmael with atrocious wages and rewarding Queequeg with somewhat better ones, or Starbuck confronting Ahab's mad quest for the white whale that functions as an obstacle for Starbuck, not just to his homecoming, but to his desire for economic profit. In the passage from Stowing Down and Clearing Up, which I'll quote at length, the workings of the Pequod as a factory take center stage. Quote, "In the sperm fishery, this is perhaps one of the most remarkable incidents in all of the business of whaling. One day, the planks stream with freshets of blood and oil. On the sacred quarterdeck, enormous masses of the whale's head are profanely piled. Great rusty casks lie about, as in a brewery yard. The smoke from the try-works has besooted all the bulwarks. The mariners go about suffused with unctuousness. The entire ship seems great Leviathan himself, while on all hands the din is deafening. But a day or two after, you look about you and prick your ears in this selfsame ship. And were it not for the telltale boats and try-works, you would all but swear you trod some silent merchant vessel with a most scrupulously neat commander." Next slide. The unmanufactured sperm oil possesses a singular cleansing virtue. This is the reason why the decks never look so white as just after an affair of oil. Besides, from the ashes of the burned scraps of the whale, a potent lye is readily made, and whenever any adhesiveness from the back of the whale remains clinging to the side, that lye quickly exterminates. Hands go diligently along the bulwarks, and with buckets of water and rags restore them to their full tidiness. The soot is brushed from the lower rigging. All the numerous implements which have been in use are likewise faithfully cleansed and put away. The great hatch is scrubbed and placed upon the try-works, completely hiding the pots. Every cask is out of sight. All tackles are coiled in unseen nooks, and when by the combined and simultaneous industry of almost the entire ship's company, the whole of this conscientious duty is at last concluded, then the crew themselves proceed to their own ablutions. The alienation of labor is overwhelming, as is the magnificence of the prose, to which I'll return. The obvious use of the words hands ruptures the integrity of the workers' bodies by describing them according to their use value. But that is not all. The repeated use of the passive voice, is readily made, is brushed, is scrubbed, are coiled, stands out. By whom? Whose hands? What are the names of the individuals doing this work? We have met several of the crew members in the course of the novel. Their erasure mirrors the whale's death. And if that weren't enough alienation for one chapter, the cleansing virtue of the sperm oil sickeningly erases, but does not cancel out because this chapter has been written, the bloody assault on the whale's body. Richard Broadhead, next slide please, describes Moby Dick as a commodity narrative and compares its so-called cetological center to Frank Norris's novels about the capitalist production of wheat. Like them, Melville's work brings back to visibility behind some product so familiar as to be a precondition for everyday life, the forgotten process by which it's been first wrenched out of natural life, then worked or manufactured into a marketable good. The labor of killing whales has, of course, ecological and environmental implications that have more recently been taken up by critics in the field of what's called energy humanities. Professor Jeffrey Insko provides this succinct definition of the discipline in his 2023 Leviathan article, Resource Extraction and Melville's Extracts. He explains that the scholarship in this field, quote, helps make visible and legible what has typically and historically gone unnoticed or unremarked, the social and political arrangements and the cultural imaginaries that fossil fuels have both served and produced. We are again back to the issue of visibility, only now the focus is less the human catastrophe awaiting alienated labor and more the environmental one, though of course they're intimately connected. Whaling is a death cult, as we see in chapter 61, Stubb Kills a Whale. Stubb has, quote, darted dart after dart into the flesh of the white whale, such as, quote, the red tide now poured from all sides of the monster like brooks down a hill. His tormented body rolled not in brine, but in blood, and all the while jet after jet of white smoke was agonizingly shot from the spiracle of the whale. It's a brutal read. The whale, quote, spasmodically dilating and contracting his spout hole with sharp, cracking, agonized respirations. All of this to get at the oil that will provide light. Light for dark streets, light for candles, light by which to read a novel that foregrounds the inextricable link between illumination and death. Insko homes in, as the title of his essay suggests, on how extraction plays a central role both in the content of the novel and the form. Famously, before we even read those iconic words, "Call me Ishmael," Melville has amassed every reference to whales that he can in a section he calls extracts. Quotations derived from the Bible, Shakespeare, Milton, folk songs, exploration narratives, and more. Insko's reading concludes with the claim, quote, that Melville's extracts, quote, do not exhaust or deplete the text from which they're extracted, but instead help renew and re-energize them and us. Amitav Ghosh, in a 2008 interview with Christopher Lydon, singles out Melville and specifically Moby Dick, quote, as revealing a level of curiosity, a level of engagement with the world that's completely absent from 19th century English writing. In many ways, his work is inexhaustible in its inspiration, renewing, re-energizing, refusing exhaustion. I agree with this position wholeheartedly. The indecency of this work on the Pequod, to use the language of SDG 8, is profound and also carries ethical implications that critics have discussed. Often the issue of ethics revolves around Ahab and his monomania, which morphs into authoritarianism, or the shocking embrace of cruelty and killing as reflected by Starbuck's Devon Flask. Ethical questions pervade Melville's writing, and not just Moby Dick. Typee, for instance, Melville's first book and huge bestseller, critiqued the colonial enterprise and earned the ire of religious organizations. White Jacket, that novel Melville would have preferred not to write, considers the horrors of flogging on ships. Bartleby the Scrivener represents the deadening labor of a scrivener, likening it to the piecework of the assembly line. In other words, ethics were never far from Melville's mind. And though, as Cody Mars correctly says, quote, it's notoriously difficult to know where Melville himself stands at any given moment. One constant remains, quote, a disregard for life itself, whether human or non-human, is what makes Ahab Ahab, and it is what makes Bildad and Peleg, those pacifist investors in bloodshed, hypocrites. Mars hypothesizes that Melville's commitment to beauty serves as a kind of ethical correction to the pain Melville puts at the center of human experience. Beauty, as expressed in Melville's writing, as expressed by that magnificent passage about indecency from stowing down and clearing up, is productive, but not by the specific standards and targets of SDG 8, but to quote Bob Ray, certainly meets and exceeds the ideal of representing, quote, the common sense of humanity. Beauty is indecency's opposite. Eventually, Melville would land on an ethical position of preferring not to. But before getting there, he wrote a novel about extinction and unsustainability that shows no signs of dying or unsustainability. How might we explain this? Next slide, please. A parenthetical comment embedded in chapter 60 of Moby Dick provides a possible answer. Ishmael remarks, quote, there is an aesthetic in all things. In a moment that seems random, but's anything but, in the chapter called The Line. Ishmael describes, quote, the magical, sometimes horrible properties of the whale line. Structurally, the chapter echoes ones that come before, with a material aspect of whaling become a platform for transcendental meditation and often self-mockery at an attempt to extract, and I use that word purposefully, a clear meaning from the thing being examined. What comes out of the whale spout is one example, with Ishmael asking if it's gas or liquid or some combination thereof, only to decide that to find out he'd have to put his face so close to the spout that he'd die. He would prefer not to. In The Line, Ishmael begins by reflecting on the fabric out of which the line is made, as well as its dimensions and its shape. He writes, quote, as the least tangle or kink in the coiling wood and running out infallibly takes somebody's arm, leg, or entire body off, the utmost precaution is used in stowing the line in its tub. We have approached death as we do in virtually every chapter, and Ishmael describes how the line, which has the potential to kill the humans using it, entraps the whale. The line becomes metaphorical, and the concluding paragraph of the chapter includes this, quote, all men are enveloped in whale lines. All men live enveloped in whale lines. Humans might think the whale is just for whales, but it's not. And humans are whales too, and vice versa. Our doom lies in not getting this interconnectedness, and Melville tells the story of this gross myopia using his authorial mastery. Next slide. Moments of clear vision do penetrate the blood-filled waters of the novel. Ishmael and Queequeg embracing under the counterpane in the New Bedford Spouter Inn. The chapter, A Squeeze of the Hand, where Ishmael experiences a kind of ecstasy overcoming individuation and alienation. Quote, I squeezed that sperm till I myself almost melted into it. I squeezed that sperm till a strange sort of insanity came over me, and I found myself unwittingly squeezing my co-laborer's hand in it. Mistaking their hands for the gentle globules. Such an abounding, affectionate, friendly, loving feeling did this application beget. The ability of the sperm whale to see two things at the same time also points to overcoming visual limitations. Next slide, please. In another chapter from the so-called cetological center of the novel is the sperm whale's head contrasted view. Ishmael explains, and here again I'll quote at length to give you a feel of the beauty of the prose, which I'm linking to an ethical position, as well as it's to sustainable abundance, the opposite of extraction and depletion. Quote, a curious and most puzzling question might be started concerning this visual matter as touching the Leviathan, but I must be content with a hint. So long as a man's eyes are open in the light, the act of seeing is involuntary. That is, he cannot then help mechanically seeing whatever objects are before him. Nevertheless, anyone's experience will teach him that though he can take in an undiscriminating sweep of things at one glance, it's quite impossible for him attentively and completely to examine any two things, however large or however small, at one and the same instant of time. Never mind if they lie side by side and touch each other. But now, if you come to separate these two objects and surround each by a circle of profound darkness, then, in order to see one of them in such a manner as to bring your mind to bear on it, the other will be utterly excluded from your contemporary consciousness. How is it then with the whale? True, both his eyes in themselves must simultaneously act, but is his brain so much more comprehensive, combining, and subtle than man's that he can at the same moment of time attentively examine two distinct prospects, one on one side of him and the other in exactly the opposite direction? If he can, then it's a marvelous thing in him, as if a man were able simultaneously to go through the demonstrations of two distinct problems in Euclid. Nor strictly investigated is there any incongruity in this comparison. Ishmael's meditation on the whale's vision is a thing of beauty and an invitation to potentiality. The whale's ability to see multiple images, perhaps contradictory, perhaps not, at the same time functions as an invitation to readers to see from multiple perspectives, to see what they might not want to see, and in seeing, perhaps a beckoning to change. There are distinct problems, Euclidean and otherwise, to be solved. Chapter after chapter demonstrates Melville opening up the doors of perception as a means of better comprehension. Sentences range across huge geographical expanses. Next slide, please. Contain analogy after analogy and capture an astonishing range of reference and emotion. Here's an example from chapter 79, The Prairie. Quote, in some particulars, perhaps the most imposing physiognomical view to be had of the sperm whale is that of the full front of his head. This aspect is sublime. In thought, a fine human brow is like the east when troubled with the morning. In the repose of the pasture, the curled brow of the bull has a touch of the grand in it. Pushing heavy cannon up mountain defiles, the elephant's brow is majestic. Human or animal, the mystical brow is as that great gold seal affixed by the German emperors to their decrees. It signifies God, done this day by my hand. But in most creatures, nay, in man himself, very often the brow is but a mere strip of alpine land lying along the snow line. Few are the foreheads which, like Shakespeare's or Melanchthon's, rise so high and, next slide, descend so low that the eye themselves seem clear, eternal, tideless mountain lakes. Could you go back to the previous slide? I'm sorry. Thank you. The very title of this chapter signals the figurative language to come as Ishmael connects the prairie landscape to the whale. It is indeed sublime. In addition, this astonishing passage travels from the ocean to the east to Germany. The whale's brow is like a bull's, like an elephant's, like a person's. The brow is a great gold seal, a strip of alpine land lying along the snow line. The whale embraces a vision of inclusion, possibility, and sustainability, and so does Ishmael, and so does Melville. If the brow of a whale is proximate to all of these things, what else might it connect? Next slide now. Thank you. The sustainability of Moby Dick is evident. William Faulkner wished he'd written it. D.H. Lawrence introduces his quotation from chapter 58, Brit, with the comment, quote, this beautiful passage brings us to the apparition of the squid. Marilyn Robinson, author of Housekeeping, wrote, quote, Moby Dick is the book I admire most in the world. Patti Smith called it monstrous and divine. And Jen Fox in Tales the Devil Told Me has a 2-page story called Dear Ahab, which includes a flipped version of cetology, this time with the whale breaking down human body parts. Quote, Your calf whetted my appetite, but I didn't want to devour you at once. I fantasized about ingesting you piecemeal, your left hand, your right foot, a forearm, a chunk of abdomen, a portion of thigh, a shoulder. I envisioned stripping you, chipping away at your person, until you were but a grimacing, cursing head. I thought I might stretch this process out, that the promise of breaking you down might sustain me. I could go on and provide many more examples, but my point is about the novel's sustainability and seemingly endless potential for readers to find meaning, to listen over and over again to a voice, Ishmael's, that is brilliant, funny, depressed, and glorious, to reflect on the world, by which I mean its forms of economy, our environment, and our ethical relations to it and responsibilities to one another. Would I go so far as to say that SDG8 should include a target that everyone must read Moby Dick? If I were writing the targets, probably yes, because I think everyone should read Moby Dick. But I'm not, and I understand enough of the discourse out of which the SDGs are created to know that this edition is absurd. I do think, though, that defining productivity is not an unreasonable ask, nor is it unreasonable to think about productivity in ways that can't be captured by gross domestic product or high-value sectors. Melville's Moby Dick points in directions: beauty, heterogeneity, community, excluded by SDG 8, that ought to be included. And so, in the immortal words of Ishmael, it might be worthwhile to consider these goals as, quote, but the draft of a draft, needing, quote, time, strength, cash, and patience to come closer to completion and sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Weinstein. That was brilliant. And
Oh, thank you.
would you now take questions and comments from the audience?
I would be delighted to.
Sure. Roy Matthew has a question. Roy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Weinstein. The lecture offered so many points of interest, but I was particularly intrigued by the harpoon line, especially its potential to cause harm when
Yeah.
it touches to the whale and it becomes like a scythe. But what I found interesting in the novel itself is how this particular weapon harms the higher ranking officers more than the low, quote unquote lowlies on the ship, because Ahab himself, he meets death that way. So does
Right.
Fedallah is like very close to Ahab, like his
Right.
personal prophet. But in chapter 100, there's also a minor character called Boomer, who is also a captain. He is cut by a harpoon on the line. It severs his arm
Right.
from his shoulder to his wrist. So, I was wondering if we could look at this harpoon line as a metaphor for, like the chains of bonded labor, basically, which
Mhm.
obviously they cause harm to the slaves, but ultimately they also in a way end up harming or consuming the so-called master on in the other end. Because looking at the novel, the harpoon line seems to cause more harm for the masters than the the whalers and the sailors on the ship. So that was my question.
That's a really interesting point, and there are so many ways to die in Moby Dick, and so many ways, as you point out, to get harmed. I hadn't thought about the line in relation to a kind of class commentary. I think I would need to think about it, but when you asked your question, what I was thinking about was sort of the bodies of the workers, as it were. And there are all sorts of moments in the novel where Ishmael will allude to someone not having all their fingers or their toes getting, amputated. There's this amazing chapter that always kind of makes me weep, and it's pictures of people in New England sort of holding up images of their own amputations and begging for money. And so I guess I see your point that the whale line is foregrounded in the novel, and that there's a connection to its sort of specific harm directed at the masters. Um, I'm not sure what more to do with that other than to observe that and then to put it in relation to other representations of harm done by the process of whaling. Do you have any thoughts about sort of, those other images of harm that that happen to the people who aren't higher up on the hierarchy?
Not really Professor Weinstein, but there is a passage that doesn't leave my mind. I forget where it's from, but it's not from Moby Dick, but it's about whaling in general. It tries to explain whaling to somebody who has never seen the ocean. It says it's like chasing a horse through the streets of London and bombarding it with spears and grenades. It's a I forget where it's from, but this image keeps coming to my mind. But thank you for your response.
Thank you for your question.
Prasad Mohapatra has a question. Please go ahead.
Hello, Professor Cindy.
Hi.
My question is when you quoted the last line, that is, all men live and rub in whale liners. I think the actual quote is a bit longer, like all men live and rub in whale liners, all are born with halters round their necks, but it is only when caught in the ship. The quote just, the line just goes on. So, what did Melville meant in that line? Like all men live and rub in whale liners. I have read Moby Dick only once, but I did not get this line. Like, what did he meant by that?
I'm sorry. What did he mean by which line exactly? I'm sorry.
This line, all men live enveloped in whale line.
Okay.
Uh,
So, I mean, I think, as with everything with Moby Dick, there's on the one hand and on the other hand, right? So, on the one hand, I think there's a reading that says we're all connected, right? All of us live under certain conditions that cause harm, but we're all in it together. I think about like the whale line and a squeeze of the hand kind of being two versions of a similar idea. And so there's a sense of all men live in whale lines. We're all connected, but we're all potentially, if the whale line gets kinked or coiled or something goes wrong, we all go down together. So on the one hand, it's like this, I don't know, kind of ideal of community. On the other, it's the horror of it. And then I guess there's one other way that I think about it. We as human beings think we're different from whales, but we're not. We are whales, and whales are us. And this is kind of Melville's radical ecology, I think. And so you read this novel, and I think as a empathic reader, when you read these lines about sort of the amputation of the whale, and then you see the amputation of human beings, it's a mirror relation, and so I think that line is just doing a tremendous amount of work. And so I guess those are the three things I would say: community, death, and community. So human community, death, and then community with the natural world, sort of extending the idea of connection. Does that answer your question?
uh, yes, ma'am. And does it imply anything like a homosexual relationship or anything? Just holding, squeezing of hands thing?
Yeah.
Because
Yes. Yeah, I mean, there are some really, great gay readings of the novel, and I think that makes so much sense. And as I was reading as much as I could about SDG 8, I was sort of seeing that one of the most powerful critiques of SDG 8 is its erasure of reproductive labor and of caregiving and what is traditionally considered domestic work and women's work. Um, and, I think the absence of women on Moby Dick is interesting to think about in light of that. But you know, there's a lot of literary criticism about, obviously the Ishmael Queequeg connection and in the Counterpane chapter, they're lovers. They're married to each other basically. And I wanted when Barbie came out, and I saw that scene of the men dancing together and holding hands. I thought that was such a powerful moment in the film, and of course, because so many things remind me of Moby Dick, it reminded me of A Squeeze of the Hand, and just to see on screen, like, dozens of men sort of dancing and holding hands together, I thought that was very powerful, and so you're absolutely right, to home in on the gay. It's not even a subtext, the gay text of Moby Dick. And if you've read any of the letters that Melville wrote to Hawthorne, and of course Moby Dick is dedicated to Hawthorne, Melville was in love with Hawthorne. Absolutely. The letters are just so passionate. And it's impossible not to see that love when you read the letters.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Shayantan has a question. Please go ahead, Shayantan.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Weinstein. So, my question is broadly about the policy of labor, as you rightly mentioned, how it is important. How do we define labor?
Mm-hmm.
So, my question is, when we are talking about labor, there is this, and also productivity, there is this sense of the waste, or
Mm-hmm.
someone doing labor but not producing, quote unquote, anything. I am
Right.
also reminded of another related novels like The Old Man and the Sea, and
Mm,
the climax of it, that after all this, what is produced
right.
at the result of this sea voyage, and
Right.
also a related idea of retirement from labor or ceasing to do the work in the structure of this labor capital of the state. So,
Mm-hmm.
how do you like? I would like to know your take on these two while making policies on decent work or labor. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm an English professor, and this question is a great question. Um, and what I know in the course of reading about SDG 8 and how it defines labor, um, I don't like that definition of labor. And I think what gets defined as waste, um, time goes into labor, like, so how can, how can, and you're thinking, hopefully, when you're laboring. Um, and so my definition of labor, I think, tends to be more inclusive. And, what I found problematic about SDG8, and was glad to know that social scientists and some political scientists thought so as well, was this high value sector language, which seemed to me to take off the table so much of the labor that from a high value sector perspective would be considered waste, but I think is incredibly valuable. And so I don't have the language really, I have other language to use, but not policy language. So I know this is just like a whiff and I'm not really answering your question. So forgive me, but I really, I do not feel qualified to answer that. I think that the absence of counting reproductive labor, caregiving, especially, that can be fixed without reference to art and writing and all the other things I was talking about. I think SDG 8 really needs to think harder about gender and just really question its own sense of what high value actually means. Because high value implies low value. And I mean, I think about COVID, right? The essential laborers got us through COVID, So they were high value sector in a way that maybe they weren't considered high value before the pandemic. So I'm just sort of spitballing here, but I don't know if you want to respond. If maybe you have a better way of thinking about these issues.
Yeah, I was also like thinking about this when you were mentioning about the gender dynamics and also these hierarchical positions of labor. I was also thinking about the idea of when we think about labor, it is generally putting the body or corporeality in the center, at the center of labor. So if we can also include notions like affective labor or mental labor as so those kinds of lines.
Right. It's hard, and like that's why I said in the paper that maybe SDG 8 is the way it is because of the issue of scale and the desire for hard data. So how do you measure effective labor? Affective labor. I think it's harder. It's harder, but something that SDG 8 should aspire to when thinking about decent work.
Thanks a lot, Professor Weinstein. And if there are no more questions, we could perhaps conclude today's session. And for a formal vote of thanks, we have Professor Anna Kurian, Faculty Fellow of the UNESCO Chair.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. And it has been a pleasure, Professor Weinstein, listening to you.
Thank you.
Talking about Herman Melville. And in our courses in India, most of us look at Bartleby the Scrivener because it's shorter, more accessible. People are likely to read it. But I think we have whetted our appetites, and several of our students might now actually venture upon Moby, which would be a signal achievement, in fact. So thank you so much for that and for the connections that you made. Your idea that if an economist could respond to what you were saying is something that we hope to keep in mind. And maybe one day we'll be back with that as well. The chair will. Thank you so much for the time, especially for waking up so very early and coming online. I'm really sorry about that, but yeah.
It's all good. It was a pleasure and an honor, and thank you so much for asking me to do this.
I'm going to buy a fresh copy of Moby.
Yes.
All right.
I just have to read it now. All the things that you have pointed out, I mean, I don't seem to remember any of so it's absolutely wonderful. It's been great listening to you.
Thank you so much.
Participants as well.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you to all the others here on this meeting as well, especially those who had questions and who listened attentively and who engaged with Professor Weinstein. We hope to see you back next week when we have our next SDG talk on Friday. Until then, thank you everybody here on this call. Thank you, Professor Weinstein.
Thank you so much. Bye.